Hello, my name is Derek Griffin, and for quite some time I've been the picture of patience with a persistent neighbor. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I made it a priority to create a serene haven around my modest home. I meticulously maintained my garden and the sparkling swimming pool in my back area, little oases that provided me with a daily dose of peace and relaxation. However, there was one person who repeatedly disrupted this quiet existence, my neighbor, Tiffany. From the very beginning, I had politely asked Tiffany to respect my privacy. I would catch sight of her casually slipping over my low fence and wandering into my garden or taking a leisurely dip in my pool. Each time, I would approach her with a friendly smile and a calm request, "Please, could you refrain from using my property?" I explained that I valued my private space and that I had worked hard to maintain it as a personal retreat from the hustle of everyday life. Despite my courteous appeals, Tiffany's behavior continued unheeded. Day after day, even after my repeated conversations and gentle reminders, she would saunter back through the gate and settle herself by the pool. I began to wonder if she simply didn't understand the importance of boundaries or if she was intentionally taking advantage of my leniency. I tried to be understanding. After all, I remembered earlier days when people made innocent mistakes, but it soon became clear that Tiffany's intrusions were no accident. With every unwelcome visit, I felt the frustration mounting inside me. My garden, which I had lovingly cultivated with carefully chosen flowers and neatly trimmed hedges, was slowly being overshadowed by the chaos of her presence. The pool, my personal sanctuary after long days, was turning into a free-for-all area where Tiffany seemed free to relax without any acknowledgement of the effort that went into keeping it pristine. I even attempted to compromise by asking for her cooperation. I told her that if she truly needed a place to cool off, perhaps she could coordinate with me in advance. Unfortunately, my mild proposals were met with a carefree shrug, as if my words were falling on deaf ears. I began to realize that what started as a minor inconvenience was morphing into an ongoing disregard for my personal space. In the end, my plea was simple and sincere: I just wanted my boundaries to be respected. I did not wish to create enemies in the neighborhood, but I needed my sanctuary to remain undisturbed, a place where I could enjoy the fruits of my hard work. Little did I know that this quiet request would set the stage for a series of events that would push me to take matters into my own hands. The tension was silently building, and although my heart was filled with genuine hope for a peaceful coexistence, the continuing invasions by Tiffany left me wondering how much longer I could wait for a change. Despite my repeated, friendly requests to keep to her own property, Tiffany continued to ignore the invisible fence of respect I'd so carefully maintained. Every morning, as the sun gilded my garden, I discovered her footprints trailing across freshly mowed grass, and by afternoon, I'd find her lounging by the pool without any regard for my clearly marked private space. The intrusion wasn't subtle, it was as if she believed that my little sanctuary was a communal amenity. I tried to be patient and assumed that perhaps Tiffany was simply unaware of the disruption her visits caused. So, I started out with gentle reminders. "Tiffany, would you mind using your own space today? I'd really appreciate some quiet time in my garden," I would say with a smile and a nod. Yet, her casual response, a light laugh and a wave of the hand, seemed to dismiss my concerns entirely. With each passing day, the lack of consideration became harder to overlook. As my frustration grew, I couldn't help but notice that Tiffany's behavior wasn't a one-off occurrence, it was a persistent pattern. I soon realized that she saw my backyard as an extension of her world, a space to relax and unwind without having to worry about boundaries. I began to question whether my polite reminders had fallen on deaf ears or if she was simply too comfortable in the neighborhood to abide by unwritten rules. My once tranquil home was slowly turning into a battleground for personal space. The small garden I had nurtured with careful attention to detail, each flower bed a testament to countless hours of labor, was now marred by her impromptu strolls and unscheduled visits. The serenity of my swimming pool, which I had maintained with both pride and precision, was being hijacked by her sporadic dips and lingering presence. I could feel my tolerance wearing thin. What had started as a minor annoyance was quickly escalating into a full-blown invasion of privacy. Every time I noticed her entering my yard without permission, my heart sank a little deeper, and the peaceful afternoon that I had anticipated was replaced by a simmering irritation. It was disheartening to see that, despite my best efforts to keep the tone civil and respectful, Tiffany was unwilling, or perhaps unable, to respect my property. In the midst of this growing discontent, I began to document each instance, hoping that the mounting evidence of her disregard might someday vindicate my need for action. I made notes, took occasional photographs of her wandering steps in my yard, and even confided my frustrations to a few trusted neighbors. It was clear that I could no longer rely solely on courteous conversations to restore the boundaries that were so important to me. The situation was steadily reaching its breaking point. While I had hoped that understanding and a little common courtesy would prevail, it became evident that Tiffany's disregard for my personal space was not going to wane on its own. The need for a more decisive measure was becoming increasingly urgent. Tired of the constant intrusions and growing frustration, I realized that the time had come to take a stand. I decided that if polite requests weren't enough, I would need to resort to an unexpected, and, dare I say, creative, solution. After pondering various strategies, I came up with a plan that I believed would finally set the boundary in stone. I would place a lifelike alligator replica in my swimming pool. The idea came to me one balmy afternoon as I sat by the pool, watching the reflections of the clear blue sky ripple across the water. I remembered how Tiffany had once laughed off my remarks and, in a moment of exasperation, I thought, what if I show her just how serious I am? The alligator replica was not intended to be a lethal weapon or an act of cruelty, rather, it was a bold, albeit unconventional, method to scare her away from my property for good. I spent the next few days hunting for the perfect prop. After meticulous research online and visiting a few specialty stores, I finally acquired a realistic-looking alligator decoy. It was expertly crafted, with scales that shimmered in the sunlight and eyes that seemed to follow any movement in the water. I could already imagine the look of shock on Tiffany's face when she encountered it. On the morning I installed the replica, I positioned it right in the center of my pool so that it would be visible from every angle. I arranged it with care, ensuring that its placement was both strategically alarming and unmistakably real. The thought of having a swimming alligator in a suburban pool was so absurd that I almost chuckled, but I suppressed the humor. This was serious business for me. I was determined to reclaim the sanctity of my property. As I stepped back to admire my handiwork, I felt a surge of anticipation. I knew that Tiffany's reaction would be swift and dramatic. The pool, usually a peaceful oasis, was now transformed into a stage for an unexpected confrontation. I couldn't help but wonder if this audacious plan would finally force her to rethink her actions and respect the boundaries I so valued. The next time I heard the familiar sound of her footsteps approaching the fence, my heart raced with a mix of apprehension and resolve. I crouched behind the hedges, barely daring to breathe, as I watched Tiffany make her way toward the pool area. The stage was set for a moment that might finally put an end to the ongoing intrusion. In that pivotal moment, every second felt stretched thin. Would the presence of the alligator replica be enough to scare her off? I awaited her reaction with bated breath, ready for a confrontation that I hoped would restore my long-sought privacy and peace of mind. This was a decisive turning point, a move that would either prove the strength of my resolve or force me to reconsider even bolder strategies. The day after I set my bold plan in motion, the atmosphere around my property seemed charged with a sense of impending climax. I knew that Tiffany, my persistently intrusive neighbor, would eventually come by as she always did. With my heart pounding in my chest, I retreated to a discreet vantage point behind a thick row of ornamental shrubs, anxiously anticipating her arrival and, with it, her reaction to the surprise I had so carefully arranged. It wasn't long before I spotted her, Tiffany strolling nonchalantly down the sidewalk, seemingly unaware of the revolution brewing within my private domain. As she rounded the corner and approached my backyard, the sunlight caught the glimmer of the lifelike alligator replica, and I watched in silent anticipation as her eyes fell upon it. For a split second, there was a look of bewilderment on her face, an expression that shifted almost instantaneously to sheer terror. The illusion of the reptilian behemoth, its scales catching the light and its open maw frozen in a menacing snarl, was utterly convincing. As Tiffany stepped closer, her face drained of color. I could see her eyes widen, her lips parting in a silent scream that threatened to break through the calm I had struggled so hard to maintain. The transformation was immediate and profound. In a matter of seconds, Tiffany's reaction escalated beyond shock. She began to back away slowly, her initial surprise giving way to palpable panic. Suddenly, she broke into a high-pitched scream that echoed off the nearby houses. The sound was frantic and unrestrained. A piercing cry of terror that sent ripples through the otherwise still morning air. I could hardly believe the intensity of her reaction. In a moment of uncontrollable fear, she even lost control of herself physically, and I later learned that she had wet herself in her haste to escape. The sheer drama of the scene was almost surreal. There, in the middle of my pristine swimming pool, floated the inanimate yet threatening visage of an alligator, while Tiffany darted away as if chased by a real beast. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on me. I had set out to create a deterrent, and now, it had unmistakably worked. The moment was as unexpected as it was satisfying. From my concealed position, I observed the entire episode unfold. Each detail was etched into my memory, the terror in Tiffany's eyes, the hasty retreat, and the echo of her panicked screams reverberating around my property. I felt a conflict of emotions. A mix of vindication, relief, and even a touch of remorse that my neighbor had reacted so dramatically. Yet, it was clear that my message had been delivered loud and clear. My property was not open for public intrusion. I knew that the repercussions of this event might ripple throughout the neighborhood, but at that moment, all that mattered was that Tiffany's repeated trespasses might finally come to an end. Her reaction confirmed my resolve that drastic measures were sometimes necessary when polite requests fall on deaf ears. The shock and alarm induced by the lifelike alligator replica had transformed an ongoing nuisance into a moment of decisive confrontation. As I eventually stepped out from behind the shrubs to survey the aftermath, the lingering tension in the air was palpable. The spectacle had not only reaffirmed my commitment to protecting my privacy but had also underscored the unpredictability of human behavior under stress. Tiffany's encounter with the formidable prop had set the stage for what would soon become a series of escalating events, a chain reaction that none of us in the neighborhood would soon forget. In the wake of her terrifying encounter with the alligator replica, Tiffany's state of panic reached a fever pitch that quickly escalated into a full-blown crisis. Still shaking uncontrollably from the shock, she stumbled away from my property, her cries ringing out in the quiet suburban morning. Unable, or perhaps unwilling, to come to terms with what she had just experienced, Tiffany fumbled for her phone. In a moment of sheer desperation, she dialed 911. The call was frantic from the start. Between ragged breaths and uncontrollable sobs, Tiffany claimed that I had deliberately placed a dangerous alligator in my swimming pool with the sole intent of harming her. Her voice, cracking and hysterical, painted a picture of a nefarious plot, complete with menacing reptilian intent. The urgency in her tone was overwhelming, and she struggled to articulate the details of the incident clearly. At the 911 dispatch center, the operator did her best to manage the crisis. Despite Tiffany's impassioned pleas and tearful descriptions, the dispatcher maintained a calm and questioning tone. It wasn't long before doubts began to surface on the other end of the line. The operator's training kicked in as she parsed through Tiffany's words, and within moments, the conversation took on an air of cautious skepticism. The frantic details, although alarming, didn't quite add up to a scenario of intentional malice, especially in a quiet neighborhood like ours. Meanwhile, I continued to watch discreetly from a distance. The sound of Tiffany's hysterical account reached my ears, a mixture of shrieks and incoherent complaints that cut through the calm of the day. I felt a surge of conflicted satisfaction. On one hand, the alligator replica had worked exactly as intended, and on the other, it was disconcerting to hear such an extreme reaction over what was clearly a harmless prop. Back at the dispatch center, the operator's steady inquiries probed for inconsistencies. She asked Tiffany for specific details about the scene, the location of the threat, and any other supporting evidence that might explain the situation. However, amidst the torrent of fear, Tiffany's responses were fragmented and erratic. The dispatcher noted that while Tiffany's distress was genuine, the account of a premeditated attack seemed far-fetched. Her careful questioning began to unravel the details, suggesting that what Tiffany had experienced might have been a moment of overwhelming panic rather than an orchestrated assault. Despite the operator's attempts to calm her, Tiffany's terror only deepened. Over the phone, her cries became intermingled with frantic declarations that I intended to harm her specifically. The dispatcher, keeping an objective tone and noting every detail, promised that help was on the way but also informed her that a preliminary investigation would be necessary to determine the full circumstances of the incident. As the call eventually wound down, Tiffany's desperate sobs faded into a heavy silence on the other end of the line. In that long, tense moment, the truth began to crystallize for the dispatcher. While Tiffany's fear was palpable, the evidence of any malicious intent on my part was virtually non-existent. Her report was automatically flagged for follow-up as a standard procedure to ensure no one's safety was at risk, but the initial skepticism about the nature of the call was clear. I stood silently, processing the cascade of events that had unfolded. From the carefully executed alligator replica to Tiffany's dramatic 911 call, and the measured, questioning response from emergency services. Although my initial plan had been designed solely to protect my property by scaring away an intrusive neighbor, the repercussions were now spiraling into territory I hadn't fully anticipated. This phone call, with its blend of genuine panic and implausible allegations, was only the beginning of what would soon become a larger, more complicated confrontation with Tiffany and perhaps even the local authorities. In the aftermath of Tiffany's hysterical 911 call, the disturbance quickly spread throughout the neighborhood like wildfire. Residents, who had long been accustomed to the quiet rhythm of our community, were suddenly thrust into an unexpected drama that seemed more at home in a tabloid headline than on our peaceful street. As Tiffany's frantic cries echoed through the air, whispers and shocked murmurs began to ripple across yards and over fences. I couldn't help but notice that many of my neighbors had already caught wind of the incident. Over coffee on porches and during casual strolls down the block, conversations buzzed with speculation about what exactly had transpired at my property. Some of them, who had observed Tiffany's behavior for years, were less surprised than I expected. "That girl always overreacts," one neighbor commented, shaking his head with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. Others, while sympathetic to her apparent distress, found the whole situation absurd and couldn't help but laugh at the unfolding spectacle. The discussions weren't uniformly supportive, however. A few of my more privacy-conscious neighbors expressed concern about the implications of Tiffany's relentless intrusion and the subsequent 911 call. They wondered aloud whether her behavior was part of a larger pattern of boundary violations within the community. A few even approached me privately, asking if I was okay and whether I planned to take further action. Their support bolstered my resolve. I wasn't alone in my struggle to maintain a sanctuary on my own property, after all. As word spread, a few of the more inquisitive residents decided to gather and observe from a safe distance. I could see them in the windows of adjacent homes and along the street, their eyes following every movement with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The whole neighborhood seemed to be buzzing with an undercurrent of gossip and speculation. While some took pleasure in the unfolding drama, others were simply astonished by the turn of events, and by the extreme measures that Tiffany had resorted to. I, too, found myself caught in the whirlwind of community reaction. On one hand, there was a sense of vindication that Tiffany's irrational reaction had finally forced attention to her repeated trespasses. On the other, I felt a twinge of disquiet at the spectacle that had been created, a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond my control. The murmurs of approval mingled with whispers of condemnation, as neighbors debated whether I had crossed a line or simply taken a stand for my rights. One elderly couple I often saw tended to their garden across the street remarked, "It's about time someone taught her a lesson." Meanwhile, a younger resident expressed concern that tensions like these could create unnecessary divisions in our tight-knit community. The conflicting sentiments only underscored how subjective the notion of privacy and personal space could be. As the afternoon wore on, the gossip eventually gave way to more serious discussions about community standards and individual rights. Some residents began discussing the possibility of an HOA meeting to address the broader issue of boundary enforcement, while others simply admired the courage it took to stand firm in the face of relentless intrusion. It was clear that the ripple effects of Tiffany's 911 call and the ensuing chaos were far-reaching. In the midst of all this, I quietly resolved that I would not let the neighborhood drama distract me from my true objective, to reclaim the peace and privacy I had worked so hard to establish. The communal reaction, as diverse and unpredictable as it was, had only further affirmed my determination to see this conflict through to its conclusion. Before long, the escalating drama caught the attention of local law enforcement. With the community abuzz from Tiffany's hysterical 911 call and the ensuing gossip, it was only a matter of time before the police were drawn into the unfolding saga. One crisp morning, a squad of officers arrived in marked vehicles, their flashing lights casting fleeting shadows over the lawns of our otherwise tranquil neighborhood. I welcomed the police presence with a sense of cautious relief. After all, I had long maintained that my property was secure and that I had every right to protect it from unwelcome intrusions. At the scene, the officers moved methodically through my backyard and pool area, their notebooks in hand. They questioned me about the series of events, the repeated trespasses, the installation of the lifelike alligator replica, and, most notably, the 911 call that had spiraled into chaos. Their questions were precise and non-confrontational, reflecting years of experience dealing with neighborhood disputes. I explained everything clearly. My repeated requests for Tiffany to respect my space, her continued disregard for my property, and ultimately, my drastic measure to set a boundary by placing the convincingly realistic alligator in the pool. I was careful to stress that, despite Tiffany's extreme reaction, I had taken no illegal action. Instead, I had simply defended my privacy with a creative, and entirely legal, deterrent. The police officers listened intently. One of them, an officer with keen eyes and a calm demeanor, noted that while Tiffany's account of the incident was emotional and overblown, it did not provide a basis to hold me liable for any wrongdoing. However, they did note that her behavior, as well as her repeated trespassing, could be subject to further action should it continue. I assured them that I was only enforcing the boundaries of my private property and that I had documented every incident meticulously. During the investigation, the officers reviewed photographic evidence I had compiled. They scrutinized the placement of the alligator replica, the condition of my well-kept garden, and even the layout of my swimming pool. I observed that the police respected the details of the situation and appeared to understand that the conflict was less about a public hazard and more about a personal boundary issue. Their impartiality and professionalism gave me the confidence that the truth of the matter would prevail in their report. In a series of interviews with both myself and Tiffany, the police discovered clear discrepancies in her narrative. While Tiffany's testimony was marked by frantic panic and inconsistent details, mine was steady and corroborated by tangible evidence. The officers eventually concluded that Tiffany had indeed been trespassing on my property, and that my measures, though unconventional, were justified by my right to safeguard my privacy. As the investigation wrapped up, the lead officer assured me that the file would clearly reflect that I had committed no wrongdoing and that appropriate warnings would be issued to Tiffany regarding her trespassing. His words were a vindication of my actions, solidifying the notion that my boundaries were indeed legitimate and that the police supported my right to protect them. The neighborhood, already rife with gossip, quickly learned the results of the investigation. Residents began to see the situation in a new light, a cautionary tale of overreach and personal responsibility. With law enforcement validating my account, it was clear that justice had been served. I left the police station that day with a renewed sense of resolve, knowing that the wheels of accountability were finally in motion. Following the police investigation, news of the event spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. The details of Tiffany's outburst and the subsequent revelations about her repeated trespasses became the subject of whispered conversations at community gatherings. For once, the tables had turned, and the very person who had long prided herself on her sense of entitlement found herself the target of ridicule. At the next HOA meeting, the stark reality was laid out for everyone. With the police report in hand and undeniable evidence of her constant boundary violations, Tiffany's reputation took a severe hit. In front of a room full of residents, her previous bravado was replaced with humiliation. Her claims of being hurt by what she described as a deliberate act of aggression from me were debunked by the clear facts presented by both the authorities and myself. I watched as the room filled with murmurs of disbelief and sympathetic chuckles from those who had grown tired of her antics. It quickly became apparent that Tiffany's melodramatic behavior was known to many in the neighborhood, and her latest escapade was now sealing her fate. The once feared intruder was revealed to be nothing more than a desperate woman whose lies and hysterics had finally caught up with her. A few neighbors, who had initially reacted with shock to the incident, now exchanged knowing glances. They discussed in hushed tones how Tiffany's actions had not only endangered her own dignity but had also disrupted the peace of our community. The evidence was irrefutable. Her repeated trespasses and her exaggerated recounting of events showed a pattern of behavior that was as disruptive as it was self-defeating. For me, the situation was bittersweet. While I had long yearned for some measure of justice for the violation of my private space, I was also aware that publicly humiliating someone was not my ideal resolution. Still, the outcome had to serve as a reminder that respecting one's neighbors was essential to preserving community harmony. And in the glare of public accountability, Tiffany had no choice but to confront the fact that her behavior was unacceptable. As the meeting concluded, it was clear that the narrative had shifted. What began as a personal dispute had evolved into a community-wide lesson about boundaries, respect, and the consequences of unchecked behavior. The humbling moment for Tiffany was now a turning point for the entire neighborhood, a reminder that every action, no matter how trivial it may seem to some, carries a responsibility to the collective well-being. Humiliated and desperate to regain some measure of dignity, Tiffany was not ready to simply fade away into obscurity. In a last-ditch effort to exact revenge on me, she hatched a plan to retaliate. However, I had anticipated the possibility of further aggression. In the weeks following the public debacle, I had upgraded my security systems, installing additional cameras and motion sensors around my property, measures designed to deter any future attempts by her to trespass. Tiffany's attempt at revenge was clumsy and fraught with miscalculation. She was caught on camera late one evening attempting to creep over the newly fortified fence. Instead of reclaiming her power as she had intended, her actions only served to further alienate her from the community. Neighbors who had grown sympathetic to my plight watched in disbelief as she made her move, knowing full well that her reputation was already in tatters. Rather than accomplishing her goal, Tiffany's retaliation backfired spectacularly. My security footage, which had been shared discreetly with a few trusted neighbors, captured every awkward, fumbling moment. Instead of striking fear or respect, her attempt at vengeance revealed her vulnerability and further underscored the futility of her approach. By the time word reached the local authorities of this second transgression, it was clear that Tiffany's actions had left her isolated. No longer was she seen as a misunderstood neighbor but rather as a repeat offender, someone who persistently disregarded the rules of civilized conduct. The response from both the police and the community was swift and decisive. My neighbors expressed nothing but relief that the threat of further intrusion was being addressed, and they lauded the measures I had taken to secure my property. Ultimately, Tiffany's attempt at revenge only deepened her public humiliation. Instead of re-establishing any control or authority, she cemented her image as an unpredictable and unreliable individual who couldn't abide by simple boundaries. It was a turning point where her status among the neighbors reached rock bottom, and whispers of her past antics became cautionary tales at local gatherings. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret for the extent to which the conflict had escalated. My primary goal had always been to protect my property and reclaim my peace. Yet, in witnessing Tiffany's failed retaliation, I realized that this bitter struggle had irrevocably altered the dynamic of our once quiet neighborhood. The inevitable end to Tiffany's reign of trespass came swiftly. Despite all the failed attempts at revenge and the overwhelming evidence of her constant disregard for my property's boundaries, Tiffany continued to push the limits. It wasn't long before she was caught red-handed, attempting to slip over the fence for yet another uninvited dip in my pool. This time, her actions would have consequences. Local law enforcement, having already been involved after her previous 911 call and subsequent misadventures, responded immediately. I watched from a safe distance as officers apprehended her. The arrest was carried out with professionalism and without any unnecessary drama, a testament to how far the situation had come from a mere neighborly dispute to a matter of criminal trespassing. The police carefully read Tiffany her rights before escorting her away from the scene. In that moment it was clear to everyone present that the cycle of intrusion and retaliation was finally over. The arrest served as the ultimate reinforcement of the community's commitment to respecting private property. The once rambunctious Tiffany was now confined by the same rules she had so blatantly ignored for so long. As the news of Tiffany's arrest spread throughout the neighborhood, my neighbors and I shared a sense of relief tempered with a note of caution. We had all seen the repercussions of unchecked behavior and the strain it placed on our community's harmony. The incident served as a final, unequivocal message: there are limits to the freedoms one can exercise at the expense of others, and those who cross those lines must be held accountable. In the days that followed, with Tiffany's reputation in ruins and her actions thoroughly documented by the police, the neighborhood began to settle back into its quiet routine. The collective relief was palpable. Residents were finally free from the constant anxiety of uninvited intrusions. And while I never took pleasure in watching anyone get into trouble, I felt a sense of vindication. It wasn't about pettiness or revenge, it was simply about protecting my home, preserving my rights, and ensuring that our community remained a place where respect for personal boundaries was not only expected but enforced. The finality of Tiffany's arrest was a turning point not just for me, but for the neighborhood as a whole. It marked the end of an era of chaos and the beginning of a new chapter where personal property was once again sacred and inviolable. For me, the resolution meant that I could finally relax by my pool and enjoy the tranquility I had fought so hard to maintain, a peace that was now unequivocally protected by law.